extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We are honored and privileged to have amongst us today Dr. Pallavi Chakravarty ma'am, who will be delivering a talk on the topic Refugee Women in Post-Partition Bengal, the different contexts and varied images from 1947 to 1971. Ma'am is an assistant professor of history in the School of Liberal Studies in Ambedkar University, New Delhi. She has specialized in modern Indian history, and her doctoral thesis looked at the rehabilitation of refugees coming into post-partition India from West and East Pakistan respectively, from a comparative perspective through which she was able to demonstrate the faultlines in the rehabilitation policy of the Government of India with respect to the latter category. Her areas of interest include partition studies, forced migration studies, and gender studies. Her doctoral thesis is under publication with Primus Books, Rehabilitating the Refugee, an East-West story. She has presented papers on themes involving partition, refugee, gender and conflict, and the archives in national and international conferences. Some of these have been published in peer-reviewed volumes and journals. Without any further, I now request ma'am to kindly take over.
So at the outset, a very big thank you and heartfelt thanks to ma'am for considering my name for this talk, and to the history department of Shriram. I think it's a huge privilege to come to this and speak, even if online, and to speak to this very premier institute. And I also, on a personal level, I really want to thank the students for a very beautiful invite. And I have presented talks in certain universities and colleges, but it was a very personal touch that I saw in the official invite from your institution. So I think these things make your institution the institution that is. So it's a huge privilege, and so heartfelt thanks to all of you for having me here. The talk, as you can see, the slide is up, is titled as Refugee Women in Post-Partition Bengal. I also just want to say now, since I have turned on the PPT, I myself will not be able to see the chat box. So if you have any interventions, you'll have to speak up, because I can't read the chat box at this moment. So just to talk about the structure of this paper is, there are three sections. The first part is going to talk about how this very aspect of gender in partition, or women in partition, the concept of women in partition has actually altered the entire historiography and the way partition studies have been written so far. So a little bit on that is where I would like to begin with. The second part of this talk will focus on why I'm talking about this different context of partition, refugee women post-partition Bengal. So how is it different, and from whom it is different? In that context, I would like to point out about the refugee women coming from West Pakistan and their experiences, the context and the representation of the same in a very brief manner. And the larger part of this paper therefore focuses entirely on the concept of refugee women in Bengal, and how that context, the very concept of refugee women from Bengal and the image that Bengal, how that is different from what is available to us from the Western experience. So that is how this presentation is scheduled. And this first part is, I'm keeping it very brief, but it can be elaborated in great detail, just to highlight the importance of the aspect of looking at women in partition. What is the importance of the feminine intervention in partition? This is what I want to develop for some time. In the way you are studying this, and this lecture will be part of, it has a module in partition. The entire course is talking about women through thematics, ancient, medieval, modern. Why partition is the one incident which is really taken up. The relevance of that is that indeed feminist intervention, by way of historiographical changes and methodological changes, has brought in a complete change of trajectory in the way the history of partition has been written. Here, Earlier, the focus had remained on what was called as high politics, just the debates between the great men and the great political parties, so Jinnah, Mountbatten, Nehru, all works the first works on partition always focused on who is to be blamed for partition and to what extent the person or the political organization is supposed to be blamed. Voices of women was really absent in these first set of works which focused on the high politics of partition. It is here that from 1980s and largely the work of Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin, who completely changed our way of looking at this event in Indian history. From just seeing it as an anomaly or as a unwanted conclusion to the Indian national movement, these femme scholars were instrumental in bringing the study, moving it away from the aspect of high politics and rather now bringing the focus onto what is the human dimension, to actually understand what partition meant. That the partition of 1947 was not just creation of India and Pakistan and a decision taken up in the high politics, in the high table, but something which impacted upon the lives of common people like you and me. So that human dimension for the first time came across with the experience when these scholars looked into the experience of women. And not only, as I'm suggesting, it's not only in terms of the themes which were picked up, but also in terms of the sources which were used. So the sources you would not normally find, absent women in archives. Which were the sources for us? Then history started expanding its source outreach into what is seen as alternate archives. So oral history, creative representations in literature, in cinema, and memories, these became like your new sources. And this factor, first of all, turning the gaze away from high politics to the human dimension and utilizing alternatives in the subcontinent history became a main contribution of the feminist intervention in partition studies. There it was very important. Now, all the 1980s largely focused on what is called as human dimension. Of course, it is no longer limited only to understanding experiences of women, but also to understand the experiences of other marginal communities, regions. Caste has become now a more recent way of looking into partition studies. But this major breakthrough of looking at from the point of view of looking at an incident has been largely a contribution of feminist scholars and the feminist intervention towards partition studies. And therefore, as I understand in your course structure also, you have thematics in which women have been studied, specifically it's partition as an event which really has a very important role in framing historiographical and methodological new interventions for not only partition studies but thereafter subsequently taking up various other themes also. Alternate archives, expansion of archives is something where the role of the feminist intervention has been important. And of course, to looking at high politics and changing the gaze from there, the scholars have not only ended at looking at just studying the human dimension during 47, but what Wazira Zamindar calls the long partition. Once again, there's a return to politics, how the state is managed under the bureaucratic intervention, perpetuating the decision to partition. In that, once again, you find the return of politics. At the time, because this feminist belief that it's not the same kind of debates which were earlier carried on with centered around the great men and the great political organizations. Rather, here also the voice of women have come up. Where is the agency? And that's this specifically in the long partition. This quote unquote term refugee women becomes very important. So it's not just to look at the experiences of women during 47 in the violence of partition, but also to look at the experiences of women in post-partition period, be it with respect to citizenship, be it with respect to their role in rehabilitation, be it with their struggles to adopt this the adopted homeland and make it of their own. in all this character, that's where the image and the idol of the refugee woman becomes very important. So you find the feminist intervention very instrumental in turning the trajectory of partition studies, and it has introduced in its process new themes as well as new methodology to analyze these very themes. So then the whole question actually emerged from where are the voices of women and where do we search for these voices. So once again, one looks and re-looks into the archive, and surprisingly, after the work of Menon and Bhasin in with respect to recovery and restoration program, which actually came up from a literary intervention, a short story, Lajwanti, or the very famous story of Pinjar, which gave you an idea that this is also what happened to the bodies of women. But then you went back to the archives and you started revising, and found that there is an entire, debate over this entire Restoration Act. So even from the official archives, you have to reread it, and you will find the voices of women. This is what has been shown in the historiographical part, and where women in partition have been a very important intervention. Now, specifically speaking of how women have been studied in partition studies, or what is the common themes that have been taken, there are two themes which for long, from the 1980s, have dominated all our scholarly imagination. One is with respect to, and which is more popular, is that of the victim woman. To use the term used by Andrea Major, women seen as the chief sufferers in partition. So that is coming out of, and that opened up various scholars like Veena Das, who picked up the idea of what kind of violence women faced. So it's direct violence, of course, rape, molestation, forced conversions, forced marriages, mutilation of body parts. That is direct violence. But within that, there is also something as routine violence, which was also something like what is coming out, which pointed out first by Veena Das, and what we see very dominant from the Bengal part of it, which may not have seen the same level of what is seen as genocidal violence in the West or in the Punjab region, but rather more everyday kind of violence and a sort of nudging and pushing which the Hindu families or Muslims in West Bengal were facing to migrate out on the other side. So you have direct violence, the category of routine violence, and what Zamindar shows, bureaucratic violence, which is you're at the mercy of the state with respect to your entry and exit from the country. By introducing very strict regulations with respect to your passports, permits, migration certificates, documentation to show you're citizen, not citizen, this is also a kind of violence, and this is being termed as bureaucratic. So the first set of works with respect to women in partition has been on highlighting the image of the victimized woman who faced these different forms of violence and was really the victim of this most gruesome form of violence. Adjacent and along with this idea of victim, the woman who was victimized, the chief sufferer, is one more popular narrative of the martyred women. If you go around in the refugee families and you hear popular narratives through oral testimonies, and even in, again, creatively shown in works of art or in cinema, you will find that there is this discussion of the martyred woman. This aspect is being eulogized and sort of, they are being raised at a pedestal. Who were these women? These are the women who fight for the sacrifice that they made to protect the quote-unquote honor of family, community, and nation, as suggested by Urvashi Bhuttacharya. How honor is protected? Now, across any conflict situations, the first targets for such conflict situations have always been the women. And, it's said that women are like post boxes, messengers to the other community, that you can't protect your women. And so there you find every situation, mass that here at the hands of the other, but also from violence within the own family. And this is also something which is very specific to the Punjab context. So I had Hindu women, and largely there are many narratives of Sikh women who offered themselves, to be killed at the hands by their own fathers, brothers, or husbands, so that they do not fall into the hands of the Muslims. And in this process, what is being propagated, through later narratives, are of this idea of martyr women, is that these are women who self-sacrificed themselves to protect the Sikhi, to protect the honor of their family, community, and by extension, the nation. So along with the concept of the victimized woman, victim at the hands of the other, there is also the concept and narrative, and there are works which discuss about this, false notion of honor being bestowed upon the body of the women, and how this has been propagated as an idea of perpetuating martyr women. And these are the women you hear of whenever you interview refugee families. You will surely get to hear of either from people from within their own family, or they have seen such incidents where women have sacrificed themselves to save the honor. A critique of this is, was it really in the hands of the women themselves to decide whether they want to be, sacrificed, or whether, how much of an agency did the women have? How much of choice did they have? And how do we get this example that surely this would not have been the natural choice of many women? It's because of this very act, recovery and restoration of abducted women, through which a lot of women who, of course it was a very arbitrary act from 1st March of 1947, all intercommunal marriages were considered as null and void, and that you had to forcibly bring back these women lost to the other community, whether it was their own choice or not. So those women who have been recovered and restored are not the women who are spoken out in these popular narratives, family histories, or oral narratives of refugee families. But the women who died or who killed themselves, or who chose death rather than being getting into the hands of the other, those are the martyr women. Those are the women who are really discussed about. So the first strand in historiography of women in partition looked at this image of the victimized women. Clearly you can see that it is keeping the Punjab model in mind, the Punjab model of violence. Is not thinking what was the kind of violence that was happening in Bengal. And there are very little works which talk about recovery, restoration from Bengal. In fact, that officially also the act was not really implemented in the eastern part, West Bengal, Assam and Tripura. And whenever it did get implemented, the recoveries were less. So it was not something which the state also did not take into consideration when they are considering of recovery and restoration. And even in the minds of the people, the victim woman is not something which is a very common representation on the eastern side, and largely this is because of the differing nature of violence. So whereas Punjab sees the apogee of violence, genocidal proportions, Bengal, where partition violence actually begins in 1946, is the site because of the presence of the gun and boundaries, as Mountbatten with Gandhi. You don't find violence in Bengal from 1947 to 1950. So it's a relatively peaceful period at that time, and you don't find, therefore, such examples of violence as experienced in the West and East. And this has a huge way the refugees are going to be treated, and specifically speaking in the experiences of refugee women. So whereas it's the ideal of the martyr woman or the victim woman, which is very, very popular in official archives and the non-official alternate archives coming from West on the western side, on the eastern side it is the second image which is more dominant in cinema, in literature, in popular memory. That is of the woman who was the survivor woman. And in fact here, as the title of this presentation says, Refugee Women, the book, the first person to really use this term and within the Indian partition context, of course, is Gargi Chakravarty, and a very influential book that she wrote 2007, coming out of partition, the refugee women in Bengal. And what did that mean? Coming out, literally, because you don't have that experience of violence, the narrative in the Bengal side is not going to be so much of victims or the martyr women. There is no such thing happening there. What is more important is the struggle of the refugee women to, first of all, even gain entry into Indian side, because, as I'm saying, the experience of violence was different on the west and the eastern side. So somewhere, you have a set of refugees who are officially evacuated and brought over on the Indian side. And one place, both India and Pakistan thinks we can stop this influx and exchange of population. So both the states are trying to prevent that migration over there. So in the eastern side, the story is more of surviving of the refugees who crossed over despite the intentions of the state and of the host community. Therefore, that's where the survivor, the breadwinner, and sacrifice also over here, but sacrifices of a different kind. These are the women who picked up odd jobs suddenly, and specifically with respect to Bengal. If you're familiar with the Bengali Bhadra Mahila, was largely colonial Bengal, restricted to the Antapur, the inner quarters of a home. That experience of the Bengali Bhadra Mahila, now in partition, she's lost her home, and she's coming to a state which is not really welcoming refugees. So you have to search means of earning, and all kinds of employment opportunities is what this woman takes up, which is very contrasting to her role before partition. So that's why, as Gargi Chakravarty is called, it's a sort of coming out, and that has fed into this notion of the survivor woman and the refugee woman who has survived. Now, and that is the sacrifice. In the process of becoming the breadwinner, in many cases, it's the way it is eulogized in Bengal is that she gave up her own personal desires and would not get married till the family is of some standing, or she would give up her own personal wishes, what she would like, rather lead a life completely of just earning and ensuring the next meal on the plate for the family. That made her the sacrificing. So there is sacrifice. There is sacrifice on the western side of a different kind, giving up your life for protecting the honor of family, community, nation. Here, it's not about violence, but there is a sacrifice, and that is of these women who largely remained single, largely remained working entirely for the family, and that sort of a sacrifice of their own pleasures that they gave up. Having said that, so there are, in historiography and women partition are really on two sides. One looks at the victim aspect, one looks at the survivor aspect, but at the same time you can see that it's not really watertight compartments, and now you have work after looking at the entire literature on the victim aspect of women, critiquing it and searching for agency in this whole idea of victimization. Works on Punjab side also have started focusing on the survivor refugee women, on the refugee women who too took up, in the absence of the male guardian, they took up the whole decision of standing up for the family and bringing up the family on their own. The only difference over here, and why this literature is relatively less like the literature on victim aspect is less from the Bengal side, is because of the very fact that refugees from West Pakistan were bona fide refugees. They were identified by the state as victims of this mass persecution, and in many ways the state went ahead with making up these rehabilitation, customizing the rehabilitation programs to specific needs of the refugees. Whereas on the eastern side, you find the experience of violence had a lack of violence encouraged both the states, India and Pakistan, to think that you would have been a deluge of refugees on that you had in West, and therefore you have a state which is not really encouraging this migration. So it is not identifying that category as refugee enough. So in that process, the struggle and the survival aspect is more dominant in the eastern side, whereas on the western side, what is more dominant, the victim aspect. So largely works on historical women in partition looks into these two figures. But now what has happened in the last decade or so, the revision is on this very aspect of, who are being included and excluded in both these images, be it the victim or be it the survivor image of the refugee. Here what has come across as works of Udit Sen shows, with specific example of Bengal and Ravinder Kaur, which for this piece. There is, even these bull images, refugees, what you do find is that a section is getting marginalized, or a section of within that refugee women. You cannot, consider it as a homogeneous category. There are caste and class divisions, and based upon this, there is a different kind of silencing. So the caste violence, for example, that even the very dense Urvashi Butalia interviews in Other Side of Silence has just the one example of Maya Rani as a scheduled caste woman and her experience of partition, which Butalia herself says is, it is a very small, it has been completely ignored, the caste aspect and the experience of the violence, maybe different kind of violence which they faced on basis of caste. Likewise, what Udit Sen is saying, that this survivor image, that the Bengali Bhadra Mahila coming out of the Antahpur, this is a very Bhadra Mahila, very upper class image. You have the experience of the lower caste women who too had a struggle, and in fact an even greater struggle because of the lack of what is seen as mobility capital. So Bhadralok had a foothold already in Calcutta, but what about the Nimna Varga or the lower caste refugees? They had nothing, no stake in Bengal. In fact, they are actually going to be thrown out of Bengal to places like Dandakaranya, Andamans, and places like that. And so what happens to those women? So whether this category of survivor and victim, is it inclusive of all classes, all castes? Is it a very all-inclusive, category? And whether it is empowerment or not, because even in this whole process of, let's say, survivor refugee women, was it really the choice of that refugee woman to become the breadwinner of her home? Was it something that she had a say in, of giving up her personal desires of having her own family and having her own personal wishes? So where is that, again, the question of agency? And lastly, what statistically is also available is that whether you're looking into Delhi or whether you're looking into the situation of Calcutta, the moment the refugee family, where this refugee woman is working and trying to make an earning for her family, that is settled, they are withdrawn again from the workforce. So this is a very sort of a temporary emergency thing where women are allowed to come out, but once the boat is steady, they are brought back into the domestic roles. Even from the point of view of the state, when they're thinking of training the refugee women, what are the kinds of training the refugee women get? What is the kind of training that the men are getting? It's a very domestic oriented, and in fact, as the rehabilitation document itself shows, the ultimate rehabilitation for refugee women is marriage. Where if you read about the camp commandants of these women's home, and some narrative or oral testimonies of them, especially from Karnal Mahila Ashram, you find the camp commandant is very proud that there were large dowries we gave in the wedding of these women. So marriage and ultimately is the same domestic kind of training, knitting, sewing, and things which you could do sitting in the home. Those sort of activities is what is envisioned for the refugee woman. It's not really about a training which the training institutes would be giving out to the 18 plus above males, refugee male. That sort of education or training is not what is visualized. The state also visualizes the refugee in a domestic role. So that question then is something which is again looking into the historiography of women in partition, that whether it is really about empowerment. And lastly, this whole concept of unattached women. So it's not that when we use the term refugee woman, ideally it should mean any woman, right, who's coming as a refugee, any displaced, any woman belonging to a family of refugees. But that's not how the state of India, or even for Pakistan, but I'll speak for India, that's not how the Ministry of Rehabilitation in India looked at. They were targeting rehabilitation of the homogeneous category of refugees, and that is an entire refugee family. So it would include, there is a description of what constituted a refugee family, and cash doles, dry doles, or allotment of homes or allotment of plots was done to the family. Largely that would be and as it is termed, able-bodied male-headed family. So who is an able-bodied male who is 18 years and above and has no physical deformity or mental condition and is able to, he would be the one who is actually the point of reference for this state. But post-partition refugee studies, and globally speaking, we should identify that you can be refugee. Every refugee has individual needs. So you have the category of refugee men, you have the needs of even refugee children, but surely you have a very important refugee woman. So that global concept of refugee women, refugee children is not what is applicable in the Indian context. Here it is the homogeneous category of refugee family. The refugee woman in the Indian context then is this specific unattached woman. So the woman who has crossed over without a male guardian, right? So, and that male also has to be 18 years and above, an able-bodied male. So it could be that you are coming with your elder father, or elderly, there could be elderly male above 60 years who are not capable of being allotted or being given any work for in terms of rehabilitation. That also then becomes a family, in the government terms, it is used as permanent liability. So unattached women and unattached women-headed families, those are what is the government calls as permanent liability. And for them, the government sets up these permanent liability or PL camps, and women's homes, of course, are also there. Since you are in LSR and you are closer located to this region, it's Kasturba Niketan, very close perhaps to your institution. You would be familiar with this, that this was one of the original women's homes, and today of course it's being used in multiple ways, and we still have only the widows who are still surviving, who are mothers of daughters. Those who, in this unattached women category, the women who are mothers to sons, the male, at the moment the son acquires 18 years of age, they are supposed to leave these homes. Now the state is not going to take care of them. So they are the ones, in fact, ironically, as it is mentioned in some of these oral testimonies, that the Putran Wali chale gaye, and those who are with daughters, we are left over here. That's the case in the women's homes in Delhi or for North India, and that's the situation even in Bengal. The difference is that above 18 years male becomes eligible for rehabilitation benefits in North India, or those who are coming from West Pakistan. But the problem is that the above 18-year male in the Eastern context again has to struggle for his rehabilitation, because there is a state which is refusing to accept refugees, which is refusing to accept that there is condition for pushing out people to East Pakistan. In that context, even the average refugee family is actually struggling to make needs in the Eastern case. So that difference is there. Largely, it's the refugee women who had daughters who continued to stay on in these homes. So in the whole idea, what is being talked about here is that you have a state which is trying to take up the role of a benevolent patriarch, and it wants to provide to its the category of the refugee women. But there also, it's not every refugee woman. The specific category being talked about is that of the unattached woman. And this is where it is being critiqued, because that's what the historiography talks of, that it should be the specific needs of refugee women, refugee children is something which is not looked into. But largely, these are then the ways and the strands in which refugee women and studies on refugee women focus on. Now, I come to the whole context of why refugee women, the context of refugee women in East on refugee women in the West, largely to just summarize is that experience of violence was different as I was speaking about it. So even in the presence of Gandhi ensured that you don't have that level of violence on the eastern side, which encourages both India and Pakistan to allow minorities to stay on and that there is no need to cross over. While in the West, any such assurances to minorities was not working and people are going to cross over. So the very first context of difference is this very facilitating in the entry and the migration into India. For refugee women coming from West Pakistan, through this Recovery and Restoration of Abducted Persons Act, the government had taken upon itself the burden, or if we call it as a burden, or responsibility, all who are being brought into India. It's not only through the act, refugees in general, refugee families from the West were brought into India for official evacuation. Whereas if you look at the context, how it's different in the East is that violence is not happening in 1994, two very high points of communal violence in the of West Bengal. So you have refugees coming in phases, 46, 47, 1950, 1992, courts are introduced in 64, the major Hazrat Bal Mosque incident violence, which had repercussions in Bengal, and then, of course, 1971 with the coming up of Bangladesh. In all these contexts, you find there are high points of influx, but these are the high peaks when state recognizes migration. But the in between years, also people are coming in. But that goes unrecognized or ignored or glossed over. And in that context, what we find is that the very first context in which you find the difference between what is happening in the East and the West is that you have a state which is not willing to accept refugees coming in, and that makes it very difficult for the refugee family, but specifically for refugee women as well. Now, in this Abducted Persons Act, of course, there is a lot of critique coming from social workers themselves that how does they appropriate lack of agency. But all this critique notwithstanding, what it surely gave the refugee women coming from West Pakistan is that they were being officially brought into India and would be taken as responsibility of the government. This had repercussions in the rehabilitation program, whereby the women's homes were set up, permanent liabilities camps, as discussed before, they're also set up, and all of this had a very fixed timing. So you have relief camp for a specific time, then you are shifted to women's camps, and as I said, if you had a male child, it's very likely you would move out earlier. If you have a daughter, you are left to really literally languish in the women's homes, and that was very unfortunate. But largely, you had a planned rehabilitation program, and that a transition from this to now becoming permanent residents there. But this was not the context which you find in on the eastern side. If you read in this slide, that is an example of the level of violence that the women coming from West Pakistan faced. So violence with respect to the other, violence which comes from the home, from your own family members, and it's it's something indeed of their own choice, but of course it can always be critiqued. So the reason primary sources and collection of such evidences, oral testimonies of violence experienced by the women coming from West, undoubtedly having seen this level of violence, this state takes the responsibility of rehabilitating them. And that's why you will have a very planned phase-wise rehabilitation program. There have been studies, contemporary social workers at the same time who have compared the refugee homes in Delhi and North India with the ones in Bengal. And they found huge difference in the financial layout, in the condition of the homes. It was critiqued even then. And that is what is coming out, that even today you find that most of these homes in the North India have been closed down, but refugee women's homes are continuing even to this day on the eastern side. So that shows how it has been and has been very sort of a neglect towards the situation in the east. But the source of that in the experience of this island, something which East Pakistan has seen. But these are very rare photographs of, as I said, these are the silences, so you have a lot of visuals and images of the victim and the women, and they are the ones who are spoken about, or the martyred women, and they are also the ones who are eulogized and spoken. These are the women who are not spoken about. And there has been so far not a single oral testimony of any such recovered women, because the families want to keep them away. And this is a very rare photograph in this camp when they have been brought back from West Pakistan and kept housed in a camp in Jalandhar. So this is a very rare photograph, but they are literally lost to us in terms of we do not have any their testimonies. We have to recover their voices either from this official archive, or we need to recover their voices from creative literature and cinema. So the name that comes immediately to my mind, of course, is Pinjar, and the itself and all seen them, or Rajendra Singh Bedi and Lajvanti, if you've heard of this short story. That explains you the dilemma of this cover story and why it's silent. So these are the things then from the Western side which are critiqued, because we don't just the silences, majesty as the ultimate means of reality. And refugee women, what comes across is they are important only if they are victims of violence, and also a state-defined violence, which is the direct form of violence. This is the concept of where the unattached woman is of immense concern to the state. And as I was saying, those women who are the daughters, they continue to remain in a state of permanent liability. So from the Western context, what we take back is that it's an impact of violence which had an impact on the migration pattern, but at the same time it had an impact upon the state's way of looking at who is to be cared for. It is specific tactic, but the as coming to experience that is found in context. Then every stage of right from into and that is what I wish to speak about over here, where right from the first very experience of violence, which is very different. I can perhaps speak, you can just go through this exact what is violence, because we know what is experience that violence. These are incidents which would show you what is the level of everyday violence, routine violence, or as MP Roy talks of low-grade violence. But that's it's everyday approach that the women faced over there, and because of which they were thinking of coming out to crossing the borders and coming onto this side. But as I was suggesting that it is the eastern side doesn't see that gory, gruesome violence. So there is, from the center, sitting in Delhi, it felt that maybe the situation can be stopped, and we do not need to repeat the kind of migration that has happened on the west. We can stop that two-way migration over here. But this is, of course, gross miscalculation, because people are experiencing what is seen as routine violence, and they are thinking of crossing over. And when they are crossing over, then they are facing a hostile state, a hostile community, and that kind of makes the survival aspect of the refugee women from East Bengal even more dominant. So it's not the experience of violence which is so dominant in the narratives coming from East, but they are standing up and withstanding this kind of very first stopping at influx itself. If you've gone through this experience, if you've read this example of the kind of violence that they are being experienced to, there is apart from this also the aspect of caste-based violence. Now, why caste-based violence is very important in the Eastern context, because of the very famous Dalit-Muslim alliance which Bengal sees a large part of in post-1930s. And in fact, for that very reason, Jogendranath Mandal, a very tall figure, today we have forgotten about Mandal, but he was extremely important, like Ambedkar becomes a law member to India, Mandal becomes a law member in Pakistan. And so just because of him, he stays on and he compels the Namashudra community, which is so-called lower caste community in Bengal, to stay on him. But in 1950, he resigns because he also sees this violence. With the Hindu Bhadra having left by 1950, we only have this Nimna Vargo group, which now becomes the target of the Muslims. So the violence is kind of that despite Dalit Muslim alliance. So this they see, in fact, 1950 is very much an attack on the Dalit Muslim SARS, and that leads to again this huge influx. But as I said, the state is trying to prevent this influx, all the more so because now it is really of the lower castes. And so you will find that after 1950, the people who are being entering into West Bengal, but they're largely being scattered outside into sections, largely so this context is the whole purpose of talking about this violent show, state preventing entry of the migrant, but it could not do the same with refugee. It has to show that image of a benevolent patriarchal state, and it wants to take care of them. So a lively form of the recovery spirit act is put across. We have the Dhaka transform, which is a very rare example, not found in the team context, but this is a home which is sort of the mom, the women can come here for some time and they feel safe, they can go back to their home. All these methods were very strict regulation of 1950, where the state is trying to keep minorities where they are and trying to prevent the influx. And this violence, which leads to this kind of regulation of entry, makes the struggle of refugee women even stronger in East, because the very first step of entering itself is what is being challenged. And therefore, in that context, so having looked at the very different contexts, one case we were revenue refugees, one case we were trying to stop entry, this leads to different kinds of representations of the refugee women category. And this is a very common and very famous film, Meghe Dhaka Tara by Ritwik Ghatak, and the characterization, the central character is Neeta, belonging to a Bhagwat family. She comes with her father, who has become, has become physically handicapped. She has two brothers and a sister. She is taking up the whole burden of this family upon herself. Very rare situation where the mother is also insisting that Neeta should not get married and she should remain because she is the sole breadwinner, and at the expense of Neeta's own choice. The person she wanted to marry, her mother gets her sister married to him. And this sort of what is coming across, this film is an iconic film because it tries to show every refugee woman in this light, that there are the many Neetas in every refugee woman was like the Neeta of this Meghe Dhaka Tara, and that they really worked hard. This sort of thing you can find in Manish Rai, of course, he's a historian. So he's telling from his own experience how his sister became like the breadwinner of the family, and her marriage talks are put at the back burner, and how they are. So the same Neeta and the concept which is actually applying the real example of one of the examples in Manasrai. And Mani Kundala Sen was in her own autobiography, talks about how, the streets of Calcutta, you start finding a lot of refugees from East Bengal. And in fact, West Bengal women are still inhibited, but you find the East Bengal women almost everywhere in public space, in offices, in trams, walking down. They're just all the many netas. They're working for the refugee family and trying to bring them up in a situation it doesn't want refugee influx, and yet people are coming out. And rehabilitation is there. Everybody is trying to make up, for the loss and trying to bring up the family. Apart from this, of course, however, is the important factor of, as I said, there is no rehabilitation from the state. It's largely rehabilitation of the people themselves. Again, a very different thing which comes up in Calcutta is famous for the Doctoral colonies or the Squatter colonies. Protecting those colonies, and this is something which is rare. It is not available in any other part other than West Bengal. It is something which was set up, homes, tents, plots of land, and today full-fledged colonies of Jadavpur in and around Jadavpur University. These are all protected and literally comes from the struggle of the women. Women were the front line, so these not doors. They're put in front of doors, and so nobody goes or breaks these colonies. So the women are contributing economically. Women are contributing in a number of left parties. Mars Mahila Raksha Samiti comes up and they really participate in political agitation. They march and for in terms of their colonies. Of course, the unattached women, as I was saying, is the same here. One, and I think I'll just point out and conclude over here, because I think I'm just overshooting the time, is this caste dimension. That partition also provided opportunities, and in the Bengal case, it was also seen as opportunities for the time. Now this is a narrative for a caste woman who has crossed over, and for her, there was nothing in Bengal. There's a huge difference in way the Bhadramata remember East Pakistan and the way the lower caste woman is remembering. She said there was nothing left for us. Actually happy to come here as refugees to the Calcutta. It's struggle. We managed in central Calcutta. We are finding in the peripheries. Then also we are education and some sort of assistance. So that the Calcutta opened up opportunities for us. This was something which was also seen on the western side, that partition for many really opened up opportunities. Many women educated themselves and jobs for some not before. In the caste dimension is also something that some of them reflect only pleasant words of what partition actually brought for them. So the key, of course, is the question of vessels concludes and done. So she lost and she that their lives work and not do anything nice. So a sort of critique of that there could have been some individual agency that women really choose this life of their own. Mitra, who chronicles the life in Calcutta during this period, you can see how he is critiquing this concept of the working of the refugee woman who is forced to come out and earn for the fact she cannot be interested in it, and she's literally pushed into it. And of course, the caste aspect is also there, whereby you find that this eulogization of Nita, just like you have eulogization of the martyr women in Bengal, it is more about Nitas are being eulogized. That was you find parallels brought with what happens to the lower caste women. And this is only one example I put with in the play that and that showed all this aspect. So you have a Bhadra family who has come with this lower family who was their servant family. In that you find that Bhadralo ultimately with all his struggles, and there is a very sad story related to the woman, his daughter, who is forced to take up prostitution, which is the case with a lot of refugee women in Shialda station, that they are compelled to take up this job in the lack of any available job. So that story goes on, and after the first 2-3 acts, you really happens to the lower caste family that accompanied this Bhadralo family. So what happens there? She's hard spoken as also has on this sort of works focusing on the victim aspect, and on the eastern side it's all about survival. But the survival also is very caste blind, and it's talking more about the Bhadra Mahila experiences. We are yet to document the experiences of the lower caste refugee. With that, I would like to conclude. These are photographs to show what I was trying to say, and what was vision was all entirely domestic roles, and that's a huge critique that one has of the state vision with respect to refugee women and their rehabilitation. There's no really out of the box thinking that is being done over here. Conventional roles, and the government is really happy, as you see through official documents, if these women are rehabilitated in domestic. So I would conclude my talk. I'm sorry if I've gone beyond.
Not at all, ma'am. We enjoyed it immensely.
Sorry?
Ma'am,
I didn't get your question.
We enjoyed it immensely. The time is not a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, not a problem there. We totally enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
I will be very happy to share some reasons also, in case you want. I'll leave that to you, because actually this is a very vast topic. It's very difficult to put it down, but I've tried my best to just give some highlight of that.
Sure, ma'am. Email it to us and we'll share it with the students. Sure, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your time with us and delivering this wonderful lecture. It was informative and deeply insightful. We would now like to open the floor for discussion. If anyone has any question or anything you would like to share, please come forward and unmute yourself. You can also type it in the chat box. We will read it out aloud. Please.
Ma'am, as you pointed out that there was difference in the condition of women in the East and West. So, ma'am, what were the possible reasons for the severity of the condition in the West particularly? So.
Should we take all questions at once, or do you want me to respond one at a time?
Yes, ma'am, you can respond. We'll take one by one.
So, Aditi, the essential difference in what my research shows and what is also shown in M.L.K. Roy's difference is largely the experience of violence. So, what I was trying to show is that state recognizes one form of violence as violence enough, direct violence, rape, molestation, forcible conversions, marriages. These are direct experiences of violence. And in that context, the state took upon itself that, that's why you had the Recovery Restoration Act, and the state took upon itself the responsibility of direct rehabilitation of such women. In the case of East, violence is almost non-existent from between 1947, if we say in this conventional definition of violence, which is direct violence. What is more evident, and that's what I tried to show in the two different slides, that it's more of a routine, everyday violence which we see in the Eastern context. But that doesn't, for someone sitting in Delhi, it's not easy to identify as violence enough. And so you have apprehensions that, people are coming out of just psychological fear, or people are coming out of because of, sometimes even as mentioned, for the cash dose. So people are not really coming out of any direct experience of violence. State is, not very outgoing or willing to take up further economic and financial burden of rehabilitating these refugees. Therefore, there's, in my opinion, it's more about the different experience of violence which leads to this difference. Yeah, I have already shared the PPT, so you can use that. I've shared it as a piece of, sent it to the history. So what's this NSR Union mail ID? And so did I answer your question, Aditi? Is that fine?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thank you for the question. Is there anything else that you want to ask anyone else?
If I could just ask Pallavi, a wonderful, very very informative presentation, and the fact that you compared East with West is like you've done half my chore. But I was supposed to carry on. You don't hold to take care of that. I would just like to find out if you think that the refugee women, as they came from Eastern, Bengal side, did it allow them greater opportunities of employability? I'm sorry, in between my phone got disconnected, so I'm not very sure whether I heard it. You did mention it or not, but the question that was coming to my mind is that, in terms of, because they're probably settling in with their families, they're probably not refugees as the abducted women case and the violence that you just talked about in the West. So if they could come and they stay with their husbands and their families, does this allow them greater opportunity in terms of employability and hence slightly better status now? Was that the case?
Yes, ma'am. This case of refugee women, it's not that there were no homes for refugee unattached women from Bengal also. What I pointed out is that these homes are the only common thing between rehabilitation of refugees from West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Homes for women's home, permanent liability camps. What I pointed out was that the homes, the treatment meted out is different, as pointed out by Ashoka Gupta and many such contemporary social workers at that time itself, that the homes are not so well maintained in Bengal side. So, first aspect is this, that it's not that there were no homes on the eastern side, those were also there, but they were not maintained, and in fact they were not planned. The planning over here is that ultimately the homes will be closed down, as was the case in North India. Those homes were closed down. So one aspect is with respect to the women who are employability of the women in such homes, there's a huge difference. They really did not get the best employment opportunities, which, statistically one can, my thesis also has, in terms of amount of cash toll given, amount of hours they were allowed to work. That way, women coming from West Pakistan, living in these homes, were better positioned. With respect to the second point, it's a very, very important, a very different way, positive at again this fact that something as partition could bring in opportunity. I would agree with you in that indeed it's give, and that's why the narrative on the East focuses on this aspect that these women got a lot of opportunity to come out, and coming out of partition as titled Trauma and Triumph, another title of the book which focuses on these aspects, that refugees women in general compare in East and in West, then you can just say that their employability option, partition came as a silver lining to some extent. But then one would also think, as I was saying, that that's why where more recent scholars like Uditi Sen, they question this silver lining aspect, because they say that it's a very Bhadralok oriented vision, that you're really talking only about the upper class and upper caste women. And secondly, what is also being questioned is that what kind of employment really are we thinking of? So it's class 3, class 4 at the max, or more common is the myth that comes across of prostitution. So a lot of these women really took to this sort of job. So do we really think that as empowerment enough? So there is opportunities. Some women, largely the women in the refugee colonies, of squatter colonies, you can say that they fared better. But that was only the specific case of the Bhadra Mahila. If you look into the caste aspect and class dimension, then one would not say that, we cannot really say that it really gave much of an opportunity.
Thank you.
Do I?
All right. You've answered my
Thank you,
question.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Last question, which has been sent to the chat.
Yeah, I was just
Somebody please read it out. Yes.
Medium of expression. So how much after partition did theatre become?
Read it out for everyone.
Okay. So Shinjini, acha, Samvidhan wants to read? Yes.
Sorry for the problem, ma'am. Sindhini asked, ma'am, like we have example of films like Komal Gandhar, where theatre association is displayed. So, ma'am, how much after partition did theatre become a source of expression, and how much role did women play in shaping up medium of expression in that period?
Here I would say the role of IPTA, and perhaps you would be familiar with that. They came out with very interesting, a lot of work on partition. And again, the critique is that too focused only on the experiences of the Bhadralok refugee and the upper caste refugee. So the last thing which I was talking about Salil Sen's work, Notun Yehudi, is coming out of, it is a very iconic cult theatre play directed in the 90s, but that also has a word but women playing in that. I don't really answer questions. There's no specific work which actually looks in the context of partition, but there are individual accounts of some famous actors who are largely coming from East Pakistan, because that was sort of readily available labor. So famous Bollywood stars also, but even iconic theatre artists in Bengal too, themselves trace origins to East Pakistan, because that was these are the only available opportunities for. But I cannot fully answer this question, because there is no specific work which is done on how partition affects the role of women in partition in theatre. So I think partially I can answer that question. Is that fine, Shinjini? Do you?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that
Thank you.
right?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Yes, please. Is there a specific work on the Bengali communities who have been, who are in the northeastern states right now, like those which were a part of Bengal earlier, but were presently a part of northeastern communities?
Yes.
Is there specific work on their experiences?
So this is again very important point raised over here. Our focus first is to critique that the works are all on Punjab, And so then suddenly a lot of work on Bengal started coming up, and now what we see in partition studies work is essentially either on Punjab or in Bengal. And of late, a little bit on Sindh somewhere is coming up. The Northeast has been neglected, and there are, not full-fledged works. But I can specific reference then one very interesting work to look at, this whole thing that illegal, legal migration that is being debated upon. Sanjay Hazarika, The Rights to Passage, is one excellent, it's form of a novel, but it's not really fiction. It is of his own experiences and experiences of his servant, and how he keeps coming in back and forth from East Pakistan into Assam, and is talking with the region of Assam. Apart from Sanjay Hazarika, of course, you have the works now, very recent work coming out by Anindita Ghoshal, which looks entirely at rehabilitation in the northeast of the Bengali refugees. So a specific focus is on Tripura and but other states of northeast as well. And likewise, there is Gayatri Bhattacharya. She was among the first who worked on the rehabilitation of Bengali refugees in Tripura. So if you want, I can put down the reference in the chat box. But these are it's relatively less worked on. So anybody interested should think of working on this with respect to northeast. Change your region from Punjab and Bengal.
Yes,
Thank you,
would you please note them down in the chat box?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. We would now like to request Dr. Smita ma'am to please give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pallavi, for accepting our invite and coming here, and of course making us very rich with the information and insights that you have provided. The very fact that you've shared your PPT also with us is going to help us out, especially me, as we venture into discussing this. And this has your presentation had a kind of value for students reading many things. I mean, not just history students, I think political science students also within history, contemporary India, gender paper, modern India, everything. I think you covered a whole lot range. And thank you once again for coming, and hope we get an opportunity to meet you in college, in person soon. Thank you.
And really thank you very much for having me. I mean, I'm just so happy to come to your institution, and Anushka and the entire team, and very, very informative questions. I'm so happy to see such a good, responsive class. I mean, I wish our students would also be that responsive. Though we receive, I must say, a lot of students from Lady Shriram College in our master's program, so we know very good pedigree for sure. So it's a dream come true for me also.
Yes, in fact, Anushka, you could ask ma'am what kind of courses can history students pursue at Ambedkar University at master's level. What do you think are the opportunities open for us? Yes, Anushka.
Yeah.
Ma'am, since there are many people there now, I will talk to ma'am and I will list it out and provide it to students so that more people can see it.
Okay. But anything you would like to suggest, or apart from, of course, the
yes,
master's?
of course.
About any program, do you want me to speak
Yes,
on that?
master's program. What could be the possible avenues for our students to apply? I believe there is a course in general studies.
Yes. So we are now, a very unique institution, very diverse in different programs, not similar to Delhi University or JNU in any way. Our pedagogy is different, and our way of assessment is also different. So there are, of course, numerous programs one can think of. I mean, MA History is definitely there. Even MA History program is very different. So no specializations, but more emphasis on thematics. And we have a very interesting dissertation component, so it makes young researchers, already almost like, for many students, it is almost like a PhD synopsis that they have actually written at the end of the 2 years. So history program is without specialization and on thematics, and it has a very interesting research component, entire one semester just about research. So I think that's very attractive. But apart from MA History, if you're looking at, then there is also, as ma'am suggested, Gender Studies program that has a lot of courses. But I won't be very capable in speaking on that because individually I don't know about this, how these programs are functioning. But Gender Studies, there's psychology, and we have opportunities of one very interesting, very recently opened up avenues of global affairs. So urban studies, very different course. That is one very new avenue that you can think of. Global studies, urban affairs. We have, of course, one thing, somebody is interested in theatre, so there is a school of culture, creativity, expression, where in fact we have one very national, international awarded faculty of stages these very, very renowned plays across the world. So there is a course on theatre studies, performances, so you can think of that. And of course the regular history, sociology options are English are always available, but new I would say is global affairs. You should think of the courses there. Urban studies is very very good field component and new area. And of course if you are interested, SCCE is there. Then the School of Design, which is again interesting. You have architects also teaching this course from a sociological perspective. And one more very good school in terms of the programs that it has, very popular, is also the School of Development Studies. I think in today's time, development studies is a very very largely employable also course. So I think one can focus on global affairs, development studies, and SCCE, which are very unique programs in my university.
Thank you so much for informing us.
Right. Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for letting us know about those fascinating courses, and most importantly for your presentation, for inculcating so many different perspectives for us. And thank you once again, ma'am, for being so caring your time with us. Thank you. We would also like to thank our and friends who have been such a wonderful audience. The participants can now start leaving. Thank you.